The agenda this week assessed the party's approaches to labor issues, mental health, and the climate crisis. The agenda's Week in Review begins, questioning how well economic policy mixes with political messaging. We are going to put a few of the party's promises under the sort of expert's microscope, if I can call it that, tonight. And we'll get each of you to weigh in on what you believe makes economic sense and perhaps what doesn't. And let's start with what I think has captured a great deal of attention during this election campaign, and that is the Liberals' so-called Buck-a-Ride province-wide plan, where they would essentially subsidize to the tune of $700 million the first year and more than $1 billion in the second year the cost of riding the rails or the buses or the streetcars or whatever, wherever you live in this province. Let's go through this. Armeen, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's a genius plan because it's directly taking on Buck-a-Beer, which lasted all of a few weeks, and I think only one brand put it out. So a Buck-a-Ride is actually transformational as a form of public infrastructure that will literally put money in the pockets of the people that need it most and deal with our problems with climate change and carbon emissions and increase the demand for better public transit. And it also rivals the highway plan of the incumbent government. So in every way, it is a real alternative to what's on the menu if we kept on with this government.
Allison, Buck-a-Ride province-wide. What do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to disagree. I think it's not a great idea. I totally get that the heart is in the right place or maybe near the right place, but you have to means test things like these because you're building an infrastructure that has to be paid for. And if you give a buck a ride, that's a buck a ride if you're a multimillionaire living in a mini mansion and if you're somebody living on minimum wage. That doesn't make fiscal sense to me.
Ken, let me get you in.
Well, the interesting thing about voting in Canada is increasingly the richer you are, the more likely you are to vote Liberal. And the Liberals in their press release on this said that this was for people living in Oakville going to the Jays game. And so they're targeting rich people and subsidizing rich people taking transit. Now, you know, as Allison just said, if you really want to help poor people take transit, then subsidize poor people's transit. Don't give $100 a ride to anyone that's out there. And so the Liberals are just targeting their swing voters, which are rich people in Oakville, and trying to win the election by doing that. But I think it's bad public policy.
Although, Ken, I mean, you're a guy who's been involved in many election platforms in the past. You'll have to admit that Buck-a-Ride province-wide sounds better than Buck-a-Ride as long as your income isn't too high and you're eligible for it and low enough income, right?
That, you know, look, elections are about sending signals about the kind of priorities that you have to the general population, and you have to do it in a way that is catchy, and you can't put if you're explaining you're losing. And so, sure, that it has a nice jingle to it. That doesn't mean that doesn't make it good public policy. You can have a good jingle and have good public policy, but this is neither of those things, or one of those things.
Okay, Armeen, you want to come back on any of this?
Oh, you bet. So, you know, we're talking about a government that is in power that wishes to spend $25 billion on highways. And that also advances the economic interests of those with more money than less money. This actually spends more money on the poorest, the people that don't have cars, the people that need to rely on public transit, the people that are looking for work that are long-term unemployed, the disabled, people on social assistance, the unemployed, students. Everybody gets to discover their city, discover Ontario and where you live in your own community. Where it fails is the group of people that don't live in urban centers with good transit. That is its only failure. Because in my view, to encourage people to take public transit is a social good. And you want to encourage rich people to take it too and not just stick in their cars. Plus, if you don't have a car, it's good public policy. If you do have a car, it's good public policy because it's going to take people off the road. So win, win, win.
All right. Having said that, Allison, is there any evidence that we know of that suggests that if you offer this kind of inducement to people, they actually will do what the hope is behind this thing, namely either leave the car at home or help more people take transit? Will it actually do that?
Well, I think it might help people leave the car in the parking lot where they jump on the train. I'm not really sure exactly who isn't taking transit because it's too costly now. So that's part of the picture. But look, I totally agree that this is it's much better to build the infrastructure around public transit than what the Conservative Party has on offer, which is to build more roads. Both of those plans seem to go in opposite directions. So what are we really trying to do here? We're trying to build ways to move people around that doesn't cause or contribute to climate disaster. So in that way, the policy wins, but it has to be paid for. And that is, I think, the thing that worries me when politicians talk about giving across the board breaks to people regardless of their ability to pay. It really interferes with that idea that the tax system, first and foremost, it should be fair. And this isn't.
Let's now take a look at the four-party platform, starting in order of precedence in the last House, therefore with the Progressive Conservative Party. Now, of course, the parties have got a lot to say. We're just putting up some of the bullet points here in the PC plan. $114.4 million over 3 years for what they're calling a skilled trades strategy. Increase the general minimum wage to $15.50 an hour on October 1st of this year. Expand college degree granting in applied fields. $15 million plus over 3 years in the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program. And of course, they got $25 billion for highways in there as well, which will presumably provide a lot of work for a lot of people. Joe Mancinelli, up to you first again. What do we think of this PC plan?
Well, clearly representing 90,000 construction workers in the province of Ontario and being the largest construction union in the country, clearly that kind of infrastructure dollars being injected into the economy is very favorable for our members and their families. So very important information that's come out of that, and previous information that we received earlier on, like the $40 billion for hospitals and long-term care facilities, and a number of other projects like $23 billion towards schools as well. Very, very important because, during the pandemic, it was the construction industry that kept on working, keeping the economy going. And we just need to keep on going in order to inject funds into the economy because the ripple effects affect not just construction workers, it affects the corner store at the corner and other manufacturing and a whole bunch of other things that our members purchase as well.
Angela, there's one Labour leader of significance who gives a thumbs up to this current government. What say you?
And I think that when his members are having jobs created, that makes absolute sense, right? From a broader economic analysis, I think that if we're concerned about productivity and productivity growth, we should look at what those jobs are created. So I absolutely support investing in infrastructure and creating those jobs for those construction workers, but let's do it with the biggest bang for our buck. So rather than using public-private partnerships that cost more over the long term and deliver less, let's build it publicly. So rather than public-private partnerships for highways, let's build publicly owned hospitals, schools, childcare centers. Let's use that money to build public long-term care homes. We saw during the pandemic, private long-term care homes actually had much worse outcomes for workers. So let's focus on what we know works and what we know is actually more affordable over the long run, which is public infrastructure. And the other piece, I think, is that it's obviously not just those skilled trade workers that we need to worry about if we're thinking about productivity. Education is huge for productivity. So kindergarten to grade 12, last year they underspent the education budget by $1.3 billion. If we're concerned about productivity, we need to be investing in youth. We need to be investing in post-secondary education, whether that's for apprenticeships or for universities. That's how we grow our economy, and that's how we get a more productive future for everyone.
Rocco, maybe I'd direct you towards the provisions for minimum wage there, which the government says will go up to $15.50 an hour. Of course, more to come on the other parties on that regard. But do you think that will act as a disincentive for business to hire more people if that were to take place?
Look, the vast majority of our members pay well in excess of the minimum wage already. And there is a war for talent out there. So it's rarely the arbitrary level that's set by any government The market really sets what you're going to need to pay in order to get the workers. What we need to be focused on is how do we build an economy where there are as few minimum wage jobs as possible, and I agree with Angela. Look, education is crucial. Apprenticeship is crucial. I wish I had known when I was going through school that one day OPG would be paying welders at the Darlington refurbishment between $150,000 to $200,000 a year. Skilled trades are a phenomenal pathway to real middle class existence that can afford houses, et cetera. And the work that Joe and his members do on the training front to really lift up particularly underrepresented groups, whether it's Indigenous, whether it's women in trades, is really going a long way to making a fundamental difference in the life that we want for all of our friends, family, and neighbors.
Lori, how about you on this PC plan? Thoughts?
Thanks. I think some of it is too little too late. Of course, we'll take any increases to minimum wage, but really, had the plan be struck from the get-go, they would have been far better off than they are right now. Infrastructure does need to happen. So similar to what we've heard already from Angela, I do support that. But I think when you're looking at public services and public sector, we all need public services, and that is so critically underfunded that it really needs to be a focus for this government, and it's not. So we need a government that will provide the focus and dedication to our public services.
How are we going to raise the money that we need to put more money into the system that you all want to see?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the issues that we have to think about is the fact that if you say, for instance, look at what I think it was the Greens or the NDP was saying, and if you look at what the Mental Health Commission is saying, they're not saying that mental health, you need to raise more money for mental health. They're saying that the percentage of health spending for mental health should be between 10 and 11%. So they're not saying raise more money, they're saying it needs to be equitable. So that when you're doing your health spending, you need to find within that health spending 10% or 11% for the mental health services. So that's not raising money.
Okay, but let me jump in on that, Quam. If you're not proposing to spend more money on the health envelope in particular, and you want to actually take, I'm not going to say this well, but what I'm trying to get at here is if you want 10% out of 70 billion, that means that somebody else's ox is getting gored for you to do that. Does that get us any further ahead when it comes to the overall health of the province if you want 10% of a static budget?
Well, the budget, I think, when they went into, when I was working with the ministry, the budget was 54 million. The budget is now 70 million. So the budget's increasing. Billion. Sorry. That's why I'm not going to be finance minister. So the money, it goes up year on year. The question is whether you oversize the amount that goes to mental health in order to try and balance and produce a fair budget. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is looking at, say, for instance, primary care and saying, how can we better support primary care to help mental health? So you're saying we've already got the resources there. How do we repurpose those resources for mental health? We know that we've got a big resource, which is families and caregivers. How do we support those, which is a low-cost thing, to give better support? How do we support them to give support? So all of these things are things that don't necessarily have to cost a lot, just like the idea of better social policy.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm going to follow up with Camille on that, because I guess every dollar you spend on mental health, Camille, is a dollar you probably don't have to spend building a prison, is a dollar you don't have to spend building supportive housing because people are not going to be homeless, is a dollar you don't have to spend on welfare, for example, because you'll just avoid a lot of those downstream problems. You know, based on your experience on this file, do you think politicians who set budgets get that?
Yes, I think they fundamentally understand the intellectual side of that argument, but I think they also are cognizant of a 4-year term that they're in, and I don't say that critically. What I think is more important, Steve, from my perspective on all of this, is that mental health, if we're truly thinking about it in terms of our health, overall health, is held to a different standard. And by that I mean, would we be having this conversation if we were talking about a type of cancer care or kidney failure? If there was a need for more service in any other part of the healthcare system, would we be saying, how are we going to pay for that? I just think we'd find a way to pay for it. And for some reason, mental health is held to a different standard on occasion. The Mental Health Commission of Canada indicates that $50 billion is lost from our economy every year because people can't perform in the workplace. So this is 2% of our GDP. So this is on any other issue should be getting a whole lot more attention and a whole lot more money, clearly, and focus to find a better way forward. If we're serious about pandemic recovery, what could be better than ensuring that people are mentally healthy and mentally well and able to return to the workplace and able to ensure that they're contributing to our economy? So I think to your point about the deficit in terms of how to pay for it, I think there are dividends at the end if we get it right.
Yeah, Tatum, can I get you just maybe to pull the curtain back on maybe some of the meetings you have with political people? And do you make the argument that you wouldn't leave a broken leg untreated? How can you leave, mental health issues, a broken brain, if you will? How can you leave that untreated?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And the reality is there's a moral imperative to address these issues, but there's a real economic imperative as well, both long-term and short-term. So we know, for example, that 70% of adults who have mental health challenges would say that the onset of these challenges were when they were in their youth. So from a child and youth perspective, the sooner you start to address those issues in their youth, it reduces the demand on the system for people when they're adults. Now, there's lots of policy areas in which we talk about these kind of long-term savings, but even in the short term, I mean, in-year possibly kind of savings, with a 900-day wait or even a 1-year wait or even a 7-month wait for access to community-based services, it significantly increases the likelihood that a child will need to go, sadly, to the emergency room, where care, the health human resources are all much more expensive than they are in the community.
The way to relieve congestion is by building more transit, like Aaron was speaking to, right? We need to expand the GO network. We need to expand regional transit in areas. We need to get that intercity transit going. We're talking maybe now about high-speed rail here in Ontario too. I mean, we've been behind on building transit. We've got an infrastructure deficit. It's hundreds of billions of dollars because transit's been so politicized. It's expensive to build. It takes a long time to build. Every government that comes to power has their own transit plan. And then there's jurisdictional battles between municipalities and the provinces, and they're asking for, anyway, it's super complex. But we need to build transit as part of the answer. And we want to build also, it's how we build communities, right? People need to be in densities that support transit. There's enough people living close by that we can justify building a GO station there or a subway station or an LRT station. And people want to live in walkable neighborhoods where they have a choice to get around. And that's one of the problems with the mode of development being offered in Ontario is that it is more highways, it's more sprawl, it's more car dependency. It's going to put more cars on the road, do nothing to alleviate congestion.
Okay. In our remaining 7 or 8 minutes here, let's talk about creating jobs and regulating industries. And Aaron, I'll get you in here first. We're seeing some awfully big numbers tossed around in this campaign, and I want to get your view on that. Because the Green Party, for example, is pledging $1.7 billion over 4 years to cover 1 year of college and paid apprenticeships for 60,000 students entering the so-called green workforce. The New Democrats are talking about creating 1 million jobs and by transitioning to a green economy. I guess I need to know off the top here, do you think these kinds of promises with such big numbers are realistic?
Honestly, as much as I'd like to believe that all of that would happen, another piece of the puzzle is not really being addressed, which is investing in the clean innovation to create all of these green businesses that people can eventually work for. Another consideration is there's a lot of really great investment happening in youth jobs, which I completely support. But I'm even in the process. I also am a consultant at SCB Consulting, and we're trying to hire new immigrants as employees, and we're having a hard time getting funding for them, people who are transitioning into the green space or have experience. So I think the funding is good, and if they want to throw big numbers on it, that's fine. But they also need to think about how we're going to support the innovation to create the actual jobs that these people can then work for in the long term.
Okay, if you're talking about investing in clean innovation, that's going to take me to a D next, because your company, Clear Blue Markets, specializes in carbon pricing and offsets. And I think we need to understand just off the top, give us an idea of how a so-called output-based system works.
Yeah. Output-based pricing system is essentially a carbon price on industrial emitters. So it creates the price incentive or the price signal for them to reduce their emissions and also invest in clean technology alternatives. So essentially it puts an emission intensity benchmark that the facility would need to meet, or if they exceed it, they have to pay for each ton of CO2 in excess of that benchmark, and it provides the incentive to reduce their emission intensity. So how much do they emit per their unit of product underneath that benchmark, so that they can generate credits that they can then sell to other regulated emitters. So it's putting that price signal and incentive to make that transition.
So you're trying to create a market, essentially.
Yeah, it's a market-based system, and it's set to protect the competitiveness of these industries, understanding that we still need the cement and steel for our economy, but trying to encourage them to produce those products in an energy-efficient way.
Okay, so if it's a market-based system, it sounds like a very capitalist thing to do. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yes.
So you'd think if you were a conservative, you'd be into this?
Absolutely. It is by nature a conservative approach to addressing, climate change and emission reduction. So it provides that flexibility and having the market to set the price and reduce emissions in a cost-effective manner. Carbon pricing is one of the most effective tools to achieve emission reductions in an efficient way, and it's used globally to incentivize that transition.
In which case, I'm really trying hard not to lead the witness here, but if it's a capitalistic idea, market-based, that conservatives ought to like, how much support have you seen in the current government of Ontario for this idea?
So Ontario, we do have a provincial industrial emitter program called the Emission Performance Standard, but that has been largely driven by the federal government's requirement for all the provinces to have their own carbon pricing system. So while we do have it, and it is meeting that federal requirement in terms of stringency and pricing, and it will be revised after the election if the Conservatives are victorious, then they'll have that system in place, and that will regulate industrial emissions in the province. But we have to think that can that program stand on its own if the federal government was not mandating that requirement? If there's a change at the federal level, will we still see this program in Ontario from the Conservative Party?
And that is just some of what we examined this week. You can find more from the week, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or on our Twitter feed. That's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.